All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Chris Hanson with E1 Solutions here, and today we're taking a look at a webinar on SmartConnect and how you can use that to integrate SAP Concur with your Microsoft Dynamics 365 Business Central environment. So we've got a lot of content to go through today. I'm going to run through the presentation. Part of it is based in PowerPoint here to start with. Then we're going to switch over to the live demo. I'll show you guys Concur a bit, get hands-on with Concur and what we can do in terms of getting data out of Concur. We'll show Business Central a bit. If you haven't integrated with Business Central at all to this point, I'll run through a few of the basics that you'll want to understand in general for any integration to or from Business Central. And then finally, we'll switch over to SmartConnect and we'll tie it all together with the theme of this particular presentation, which is taking Concur and Business Central and integrating the two. Finally, we'll finish it up with Q&A, and I'll talk a bit about what our plans are for the future with SmartConnect and Concur and where we're moving in terms of how we connect to it. So, bit of introduction. This is myself, Chris Hanson, the SmartConnect product manager here at E1 Solutions. So I've been with the company for over 10 years now, and for the entire time I've been here, I've been working with SmartConnect in some way, shape, or form. So picture on there, that's my family. We're based here in Fargo, North Dakota. So most of the year it is brutally cold. So we're kind of ending our current season of hospitable weather heading into winter here. But for today, what we'll be going through, I talked about it briefly, is we're going to start with the overview of SmartConnect. If you haven't seen SmartConnect before, this will get you an idea of what we're going to be looking at. If you've been using it to this point, it's going to be a bit of review for you. Then we're going to spend a bit of time on Concur itself. So there's a few different modules that Concur offers. We're going to talk about those, talk about how each of them exports data out or allows you to send data in. And then also there's some tricks on how we can go ahead and configure that data that it's sending to us. So we have some control over the information provided. We'll switch over to Business Central. We'll look at how we connect with that. And then we'll run through the actual demo of seeing that data integrate back and forth. Finally, we'll dive into SmartConnect, talk about some of the additional features that you're going to want to put on to any integration that you set up, whether it's Concur or not, just in general, some tips and tricks around that. And then finally, our Q&A at the end. So if you're not familiar with what SmartConnect is at all, that's our integration platform that we've had for about 12 or 13 years now with E1 Solutions. So we've got a variety of different connection points in it, which I'll talk about in a moment. But the main idea behind it is you can set up your integrations, whether it's migration of data, whether it's an ongoing synchronization, user-driven data where the user pushes the information off. You can set up those integrations within SmartConnect without having to write code or requiring a developer to maintain them for you. So the one grid the graphic I'll focus on here is this one that we have to describe what SmartConnect does. We've got it broken out into kind of those four main categories. If we start at the top, the data source, that is where you're getting your data from. So we have a wide range of dedicated connectors or connections already set up in SmartConnect, where you can go ahead and just pick and choose where you want to pull that data from. And then additionally, we have the ability to connect to different REST and web services and pull that data in, as well as just grabbing data from files and other older on-premise systems. Now, if we skip to the bottom of this graphic, the destination, that's where we're able to send that data to. So again, a lot of the same connection points we have for data sources will show up in the destination section. It's a little bit more limited because for sending data into an environment, you need a full dedicated connection for it, not just the ability to read data from there. So there's a couple less options on that, but every destination that we do have built out will allow you to push data through based on whatever the API allows for that destination. Now, where SmartConnect is most powerful are actually those two middle blocks, the triggers and that transform section. So looking at triggers, this is determining when you want your integration or when you want your process to run. So depending on where you pull that data from, you've got options to make it a true real-time process where it's going to fire the moment it sees something occur. We can make it change tracking. We can make it a manual process. We can schedule our integrations out. So you have a lot of different capabilities and options that you can deploy when you're looking at putting SmartConnect in to handle your integrations. Now with the transformation section, this is where we're taking that data that's picked up from the data source where we're grabbing it from. And before we hand it off to the destination, we're able to do any of that transformation that we need. Because it's very rare that you're going to find two systems that match up perfectly where you can just pass the data from system A to system B. You're going to have to do different translation tables or lookups or a calculated field. Or depending on your destination, you may need to pull data back from that system before you pass anything in to validate it. So those are the types of actions that we build into SmartConnect, into our mapping screen to make building these integrations easier. And you'll see that a bit when we dive into SmartConnect and jump through it here. Also, if anyone on the call wants, feel free to send through questions at any time while we're on this webinar. There's a questions, there's a chat pane. Send your information in through either one of those. I'll make sure to check that periodically as I'm going through this. So switching gears a little bit, let's switch over and talk about Concur. So when a client or a partner or a customer approaches us and they're looking at integrating with Concur, they're normally talking about one of three main modules. And actually, they're normally talking about two of the three main modules, even though I'll talk about all three of them here. So the first one is Concur Expense. So that's the main option for tracking any of your expense data. We use it internally. I'll actually show everyone on this call the internal Concur that we use, parts of it, not all of it, obviously, so you can't see all of our expenses, but you'll see how we leverage that. I'm going to have it integrated. So that tracks any expenses you have. They've got mobile apps. You can take pictures of your receipts. It will track all of your employees, whether they're using a company card or their own personal card they need to be reimbursed by. That's all tracked by Concur Expense. The second main module they have is Concur Invoice. So this is more on the invoicing side, tracking and relating that to AP. We don't use this ourselves internally, but we have plenty of clients that come to us across both expense and invoice, asking to integrate it to their ERP, to Business Central, Nav, whatever they may be using. And the third option is Concur Travel, and that's just for tracking all of your travel needs, whether you're flying, doing rental cars, any other mode of transit. That one is not normally a module that is requested to be integrated to an ERP or to a financial system. So we're going to focus mainly on Concur Expense and Invoice. But each one of those is a different offering from Concur in terms of what you can buy from their price list. Now with those three different options, we're going to look at the common integration points that come up, the requests that we get most often at E1 based on what the client might be using. And by far the most common requests revolve around AP and GL. So it doesn't matter if it's Concur Expense, could even be Concur Invoice. The majority of the time, the request is to take data from Concur and send it to Business Central, send it to Nav, send it to a different ERP. They want to work with that data to generate the correct general ledger entries. They want to create the correct AP invoices. This is probably 90 to 95% of our requests is data flowing from Concur to Business Central. So that's what we're going to focus on the webinar for today. But beyond that, there are different integration points that do get questions around. We do have questions around vendors, would probably be the third most common item. And that is actually vendors going from the ERP or from the financial system back to Concur. They want to use the financial system as the system of record. They want to take any new vendor that gets created in there and create a matching entry on Concur, whether it's within normally within Concur Invoice. The POs and receipts, this isn't all that common, but it's probably the fourth most common one that we have in here, where they want to do like a three-way match, where they want to create purchase orders and match the receipts back to Concur. So again, that's sending data back to the SAP Concur system to complete the process that's being run. So in any case, whatever option you're going to be looking at, it's important to know how we're able to access that Concur data. On the webinar, I'm primarily focusing on getting that data out of Concur, but I'll also touch on what we need to do if we're sending that information back in. And a little bit of that falls into what our future plans are with the Concur connections. So for how to access Concur data, and again, this is primarily focused on if you're using that Concur data, you want that extract data from there to generate your AP or your GL within Business Central. They have three main methods for how to access it. The first and the cheapest option that's available for whatever level of Concur subscription you have, is just a manual download of the extract file. And I'll show everyone on the call that. I'll go into our own internal Concur system, show you how we can go ahead and download that file, what it ends up looking like after we open it up. The second option is a scheduled export to an FTP server of that same extract data. So what I'm talking about when I talk about this extract data is if you're in, I'm going to use Concur Expense for my example, but it's a almost identical process for Concur Invoice, is for us internally for Concur Expense, we have about 10 different employees that have their own accounts in Concur Expense. And we do one expense batch a month. So I've got my own batch where all my expense entries that I put in for that month go into that batch. I have to match off all the receipts, verify the amounts are correct, flag all the correct categories on it, and then I submit my batch. Once that batch is approved, and all the other employee batches are approved, you're able to go ahead and take that data and extract it from Concur. Now, they don't allow you to grab that information before the expense entries are complete for the month or before those batches have been closed out for whatever period you're using. So we do this monthly. At the end of the month, we have to all submit our own batch or submit our own reports. They all get approved and go into this batch. Once that's closed out by our controller, that's when we can go ahead and start getting this data and send it across to our ERP, to our financial system, over to Business Central. The reason Concur does it this way is because they don't have a process so that, and ideally you wouldn't want to do this, you don't want to grab that data while it's still able to be edited or changed. So that's why they wait till the batch is fully closed out. You can no longer edit it within Concur before they allow us to grab this information and use it in an external system. Now there's other pieces of data you can grab at any time from Concur through their API, which I'll talk about in a minute, but those are not related to the information you need if you're generating GL, AP, the POs or receipts and matching. That's all part of this batch process that they have set up. So I'll show you kind of what that looks like. Again, I'll reference our internal Concur on there, but in either one of these first two cases, when we manually download that file, or if we set up Concur to schedule and automate the process of generating the extract data out to an FTP server of our choosing, it's the same set of data. They give you a file of that extract data. By default, it's a CSV file, I believe, and it's got a default set of 255 columns in there. Now, the majority of those aren't used. We'll take a look at how they do naming on the columns of that data. But at this point in time, Concur is focused on a file export in terms if you want to get that extract data. Now that brings me to my third point. The third option is we can go ahead and grab this data from the Concur API or through their web services. Now, the interesting thing with this is that if we're still working with that extract data, that data that we need to generate GL or AP from, if we call their API, that API still returns as a file. It's kind of an odd process on here. Normally, if you call a web service an API, you expect to get the data back in a payload or in a stream of data, and you can use it immediately. Their API still gives us the file. So out of their three options on how to get this information, all three of them give us a file at the end of the day. So that kind of affects what we do with, and how we connect to Concur at this point in time. So grabbing all that data, and again, each one of these options, the first one, manual download, that's free from Concur. You pay a little bit more. I don't have the numbers per month or annually. For the scheduled export, you pay yet more for access to their API. Now, they do give us a file through their API endpoint for this information. However, if you're working with other sets of data, like say that vendor information, their API does function like you'd expect around vendors and around other information. You can send data directly to it, create a vendor, you can pull vendor information, and it gives it directly to your call. It doesn't generate that file. Now, the explanation I've got from Concur up to this point in time is they give us that file because once they've closed all the batches and it's no longer editable, that's when they go ahead and generate the data for us, and it just happens to be in a file format. So we're working on seeing if they'll change anything around that. At this point in time, they won't. So we're going to go ahead and make some new features in SmartConnect to be able to handle this a bit better when we talk about our future plans here at the end of the call. So that's what we work with today. What I want to do now is I want to actually hop into the different applications. We'll go into Concur, we'll go into Business Central, we'll go into SmartConnect, and we'll work through each of these and see how they work together. And I'll run through a few different main points on each of them in terms of how we should be using them. So the first area I'm going to move into is to Concur. So let me make sure that you guys can go ahead and see the screen here. Make sure we're sharing this. So this is my Concur environment. So I've logged in as myself. I've got some extra rights in here, so we got a few more windows. If you haven't seen Concur expense, it's fairly straightforward. So right now I'm working on my September expense report. Not too bad so far. It's under $1,000 for the month, but I have a couple new expenses in here that I need to add to it. So any expense you track, I can add to my report from here. And again, obviously this is just background information on Concur. But what I'm able to do is highlight my expenses, say, all right, those are all going into September 2019. Now I can go ahead and see all my expenses that are tracked in here. I'm able to match them up, attach the receipts, and when I'm done, I can submit my report. So that's the main thing I wanted to point out is every employee will go ahead and have their expenses. They can track them. They submit their report when they're done and they've got everything matched up and there's no more exceptions on that. Now, once that is done, that's when we can go ahead and generate that extract data or that extract file. Now, if we were doing this the manual way, somebody would come into the company, go into tools, and what we'd do from here is we'd go into the monitor batches or the payment manager, and we'd be able to go ahead and download one of these files here directly from this window. So what that's going to do is we'll go ahead and download an extract file for me. I believe that might do it on a different page. And we'll go ahead and I can open that up and I can view the different expenses that it generates. So what this ends up looking like by default, if you've done no customization to that extract data that comes out, is it might look something like this. Now I've opened this in Excel. It's a CSV file, but Excel's a little bit easier to read here. But what I've got is our expense reports for all of our different employees on here. Now for this file, I've changed some of the names and some of the amounts and the dates and such, so it's not actually real data anymore. Otherwise, my controller would not be happy with this particular webinar. So what I've got is you can see our different employees coming across. You can see the different expense reports. And as you go through, you can see all these different columns on how we have it categorized, where the event was at, and where the fee is coming from in terms of the vendor description. Now, this is the default extract file. So any column that I use inside or any field I use in Concur for my expenses ends up getting placed in this file in a particular order. So in this case, we've got our general account code as one column. But if I continue along here, I've also got a department column. And when that happens to be it for the columns that we use. I want to point this out because with the default extract file, it does change a bit depending on how you've configured Concur and how you've configured expense or invoice, because on any of those screens, you can make new fields required, you can add and remove fields from their windows and from their interface, and that actually changes what this output or what this extract data looks like. So that's one of the main challenges we've seen. We've had multiple requests on why we don't have Concur templates at this point. So what we're going to do is we're going to put some Concur templates out with the base extract data that you'd get from Concur. Now, we're going to have to put a description on there saying, if you've customized or if you've configured Concur at all, it's going to change what data is in here. So you'll likely have to change our template and change our mapping, but we'll at least have a starting point. So I just wanted to point out that this file and this layout is going to change from customer to customer. If you're a customer yourself, you've probably got a different file layout than I've got here if you're using Concur. If you're a partner, if you've worked with multiple customers, then you'll see that those differences are apparent once you start looking at a sample export from their system. Now, with this data that gets extracted, we do have some control over how this appears. I said this is just the default Concur layout, this extract file that we'd be working with. And as you can see in here, my account code isn't actually my full account code. We use 3 different segments internally for our account code. So this would be one of them. We also have another one that's department that's part of it, and then we hard code the third one. So with the default extract file, it works, but in SmartConnect, we have to go ahead and combine those different values together to generate our full account string. So we can do that, that's fine. But if you want your extract data to be a bit more readable, if anybody else is ever looking at it, within Concur, you do have the option to go ahead and configure how it exports that data. And that applies to both this manual download that I just did, the FTP drop, and the API call that gives us the extract data back to us. So we'll affect all three of them if we make any changes here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into our expense settings, and I'm not going to follow through with these changes, but I'm going to show you where it's located. And it's actually under the main connection under the advanced setting in here. We can take a look at that expense file export. So like I mentioned, this affects any one of the three main ways we can connect with Concur, and this gives us control over how that file is going to be formatted and what it's going to look like when we pick it up. So we'll let this load in here, and by default, we've got it set to use the default GL file format. Just for now, I'm going to change this to use a custom one. And once you do that, you're now able to go ahead and set all these different settings along the way here. So I'm not going to dive into every single one of them in detail, but I am going to talk about a couple main points in here that might make your lives easier when working with Concur and trying to integrate it to different areas. The first one is the account string. Like I mentioned, we had more than one segment, and that's determined by the account code, the department, and a hard-coded portion of that. So what we could do from here is we can add these fields in the needed order for the different sequences. I can set my constant value for any constant that may be there. And now we can go ahead and build our account string on here. And within Concur, there's different settings in terms of how you tie it to what ERP you're using. So you're able to go ahead and define the delimiter and how the account string is actually formatted on that side. But from here, you'd be able to go ahead and build your account string together so that when the file exports, it's building that account string for you before we need to go ahead and pick it up at all and go ahead and modify it using SmartConnect. Another option on here is around the general settings. So again, we've got a few different batches that are being generated each month, so I'd have to pick one of these. But we get a few different options in here. One is to go ahead and put quotation marks around text and list fields, which could be important depending on what data you may have in there. If for some reason you've got you're working with something that has the delimiter for inches, so you've just got the double quote in your data, this would prevent that from breaking the export file. Same thing if you're making a journal entry out of your data. A lot of times you're going to want an offsetting line at the very end to go ahead and offset all of the amounts or all the debits you may have in that file already. You can default the account code for offsetting. If the account code may change depending on your data, that is also something we could handle in SmartConnect. But for straightforward cases, this does simplify it quite a bit. Additionally, we can also change that file format. Again, if you have people that are used to Excel rather than CSV, we could put it in there. You can define a few of the other main options. Again, I won't do the details summary copy, but we can also go ahead and say whether it's got a header or not, and you can order what fields actually go into your extract file. So there's a lot of control over your data and how you export it. And a lot of the clients that I talk to aren't aware that they're able to modify this at all. They just work with the default extract of that information that normally sends extra data that's not needed, or it sends information that we have to do extra work within SmartConnect to modify that and translate it before we send it to the destination. Now, before I forget, since this is our system, I will switch this back to the default format, but this is the window or the settings where you're able to go ahead and modify your Concur extract information. So that's enough talking about Concur for now. Let's switch over and talk about Business Central for a moment, and then I'm going to tie it all together with SmartConnect and with our demo and our application. Now with Business Central, there's Business Central Online, which is what I'm using right now. The latest version of Dynamics Nav is also called Business Central as well. It's just the on-premise version of it. So I'm showing the online version, but anything I talk about or show here applies to both deployment types and would apply to earlier versions of Nav if you happen to be using one of those and are on this webinar and are interested in it. So with Business Central, a couple of things I just wanted to point out in general if you're looking at integrating with it. Business Central Nav is unique in that they don't expose their full API to other systems right away. Now, if you connect to Dynamics 365, customer engagement, CRM, Salesforce, Dynamics GP, almost any of those other products, if you connect to them and provide the correct credentials and authentication, you get access to all of their API immediately. With Business Central, what we want to do is we need to publish the different web services that we'd be working with. So in our case, let's think about moving this Concur data over. We're going to be working with AP or GL in my example. So I'm going to be looking to publish the service for the general ledger entry, and I'll also be looking to publish the service for the purchase invoice screen within Business Central. So to do that, we'll just drop into the web services window. So again, if you want to expand this idea out beyond integration between just Concur and Business Central or Nav, anything that you want to pull data from Business Central or any data you want to send to it, we need to make sure there's a web service published for that page we're working with. Now there's a lot in here, and some of these lists, when you open it up, when you go to this web services window, will be published automatically by either Power BI, by other extensions or third-party apps you've tied in. They may have published some of their own services already. But what we can do, and I'm going to go on the assumption that our services are not published yet, is I can go ahead and create a new one on here. It will let me pick the type of service. So with SmartConnect, we're always working with the page service on there. And then from that list, we can go ahead and find the service we want to work with. Now we're looking at purchase invoice and the general ledger entries. So I've already found general ledger entry. That'll be one of the two that I publish. The other one will be the purchase invoice that we go through. So I can pick that ID. It's going to put the name in there. The final step is to give it your own name. So I normally just call it the same thing that this name is. I believe I've published this in the past, so I'm just going to put a 2 at the end of it. It's not going to harm it to publish it again, as long as I put a unique name in there. And the final step is just to click this icon on here for the column that says published. So when I move off of that or lose focus, that service is now published and it's available to any third-party application or to your developer or anyone else that wants to interface with it. So that's all it takes to go ahead and publish a service, but it's important to remember to do so, because if you want to work with vendors or purchase invoices, etc., you want to ensure that that service is found in the list. So that's the main thing I wanted to talk about in general on Business Central, is just a little quirk to their API or to their web services, and that we need to publish the service before we can interact with it. Now, where we're going to be sending our information to for this particular demo is we're going to be creating purchase invoices based off this Concur export. So I wanted to flip to this window first, just to show that right now there's currently nothing in here. So anything we bring in is going to be brought in live based on what we're working with. Now this is all going to be brought in by SmartConnect, and I'll show you the sample data that we're working with from a Concur export that I, again, modified just to make sure it's not real data from some customer from our own system. I'll show you the SmartConnect integration of the mapping and how it's powered, and then we'll talk about how that all fits together. So what we've got inside of SmartConnect is I've navigated to smartconnect.com, and this may time out. Yep, I spent too much time talking on the webinar so far. So let me log back in to our company. And I've got an integration in here that's tying my Concur invoice extract data to the purchase invoice inside of Business Central. So what I'm able to do is I'll dive into this later and we'll take a look at the actual field mapping, but right now I've got this configured so I can go ahead and run this map, or run this integration process. I'm just going to pull this information across. Now, I'll leave it on this screen because I want to take a look at the data with everyone first before we try to pull this over. So if I expand this out, this is my line of data. I have modified this information to match my demo environment for Business Central, but this original export was formatted from a customer or from a client system from their Concur invoice environment. So in this case, we're working with different vendor names and their codes. They've got a lot of address information that I haven't filled in. But what we're going to do is create a different purchase invoice based on every unique entry in here with the vendor and with the report ID. So you'll probably notice, looking at this data right away, we do have some bad information in here, which is on purpose. We're going to show you what happens if we get a failure, because if everything worked flawlessly, then you guys know it's not real. We want to make sure we encounter at least one issue as it's going through and show how to handle that. But the rest of the information in here will match up with what we want. We've got the different request IDs coming across, so each unique combination of those will create a different invoice. We've got a title in here. We've got invoice numbers, dates, total amounts, etc. And as we continue along, we should also have the item price and a final journal code and amount for what we're bringing in. Oops, let's undo any modification I've made. So With all this information, this is what's getting picked up by SmartConnect, and we're going to be mapping it in. Now, this is the only live integration I'll be showing, but again, same thing applies if we were going to the GL with that expense information that I pulled internally. It's just a matter of mapping the different fields where they need to for your destination once you have this information. So there's no main difference to that once it starts to run. Now let's go ahead and run this process. I'm running it manually so everyone can see the results as we're on the call here, but ideally this would be a scheduled or an automated event. So this would be running in the background and we wouldn't have to go in here and click it to run the integration by hand. Now I did that because we've got 5 different records. 4 of them did successfully go into Business Central. Like expected, 1 failed. And if I show the detail on here, this is coming back from the Business Central, from the Dynamics Nav web services, and it's mainly complaining about my vendor. That bad vendor value I tried to pass in is not working. They give us a little bit more information on here, but that's the phrase that we want to work with. So from there, depending on the error we got, we could either try to fix up that integration process, change our mappings, which I don't think is the issue. I think instead the issue is with the data itself. So we'll show what we can do around the mapping to go ahead and fix up any error that we do encounter. So I'll do that in a second. For right now, I just want to close this and we'll take a look at what those look like inside of here. So once I refresh it, we've got the 4 that did come in successfully. If I take a look at any one of these, we should see multiple line items on it for the differing amounts, along with the header information with our vendor information that came across for this purchase invoice inside of here. So you can see our different GL accounts. We've got that flagged correctly, the amounts, quantity, everything looks good. The documents that did go in. Now for the one that failed, I've got a few things set up on here. One is I've got an email alert for anything that happens to go wrong. So let me go ahead and open up my email that I would have received here. So this is actually going to a couple people. I've got this email alert set up, so any failure on that particular integration is sending myself and Ethan, he's a support tech here with the company as well, is sending us an alert that something's gone wrong. It's got my map ID directly inside of here. It's got the actual failure message, how many records went through, what run number it was, and then I've even got it attaching the failed data. So if I open this up, this should open just the failed records that I have. So rather than the entire data source again, with all those columns, the failed data only contains the rows of information for the failed records. So I can go ahead, see this email, see what went wrong, look at my run number. Now I know I need to take action on this and actually go fix it up. So again, this is the same for any other integration that we create in SmartConnect. We can build what we think is the perfect integration, but we also want to be sure that we have the needed features around any integration process, so if something does go wrong like this, we get alerted of it, and then we have our action steps on how to handle that and fix it up. So for fun, let's go ahead and fix this. I know the issues all around the vendor name and vendor code. So let's go back into SmartConnect. We'll reprocess the integration, but we won't send the entire thing again. Instead, we're going to look at just the failed records that happen to occur. So I'm going to look at our error processing window, and we're going to go through. Again, my email said map run number 47. So that's the one we're going to go ahead and expand, and then we'll edit this because we want to rerun this one line of data. So inside of here, again, if I wanted to, I could click on that once again to get my full error message, so complaining about my vendor again. And then I can actually make changes in here if I need to. If I know the data is bad and I know that the source system is fixed up, but I don't want to trigger the whole process again, I can make the changes that I need directly inside of here, and we can send that through. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to use one of my vendors from the file that I know is good. It's going to be AR Day Property Management. And with that, I will change the code in here to make sure it matches that new vendor. Now I can go ahead and adjust this data before I rerun it. Now from here, we could export these changes out to Excel if I want a copy of what I've changed. I can save the changes and run it later, or I can rerun this particular integration. It's going to run to my Business Central client now. And when it reruns it, now we've only got one record count. We fixed up the failed data so it says successful, which means when we go into Business Central here, we'll now get the new entry in here for AR Day Property Management with the amounts that had happened to fail on that particular one. So that allows us to clean up that data With our error processing, we got the email alerts that something went wrong, and we could fix that up as well. So I've spent a lot of time talking about the other systems. We've ran through an integration showing that data running in. So let's take a look at what the integration itself actually looks like and how we do the field mapping. So I'm going to go ahead and open up this particular integration, the Concur to AP invoices. Now, as this is opening, I want to talk about a couple things. One, I've been showing, Business Central Online tied to Concur, and I'm also showing SmartConnect.com. We also have another deployment method for SmartConnect, which is our on-premise SmartConnect environment. So if you're working with SmartConnect, if you purchase it, as a SaaS product or purchase it monthly, you get access to either version of the SmartConnect deployment, whether you want to use .com or whether you want to use on-premise SmartConnect. With both of those deployment types of SmartConnect, both of them will work with both Business Central or Nav on-premise, and they will both work with Business Central online. It really depends on what your system looks like in terms of what SmartConnect that you want to use. But up to this point, everything I've talked about between the two systems functions the same. Kind of like everything I've talked about, Business Central applies to both the online and the on-premise environment. Now, for any map or for any integration process that we've built, there's a few main components to it. First is the details of that integration. Then we determine where we get our data from, our source. Finally, we determine where we send it to. And the last major step is the integration tab, where we define the individual field mappings and whether we have to do any translation of that data as it's being passed through. So for this particular one, our Concur export, I've got it formatted to be exporting in an Excel format from my system. So I'm grabbing this as a workbook where I have the folder and the field path defined as part of my data source, and that's just where we're getting the information from. Where we're sending it to, again, is we're going to Business Central. So we're going to their OData endpoint, and we're working with those services that we happen to publish. So if we wanted to, I could actually click Refresh Services on here. And we just stepped through Business Central a few minutes ago to publish that new service, that new OData service or the page service we were working with. We should see that in this list if we wanted to add it in as well. So I click that. It's going to take a few minutes because it's grabbing every service from our Business Central environment. But when I click the drop down now, I believe I put the number 2 at the end. So there we go. The General Ledger Entries 2, that service I published live with everyone on the call here, that shows up as one of the services to integrate with, whether we wanted to pull data or send data to it. That allows us to go ahead and work with that along with any of the other published services in the environment. Now, when you're setting up an integration, if you want to do some troubleshooting on there, we can run that to file. If we wanted, so instead of going to Business Central or Nav or to your destination, that will send the output to file so you can see what SmartConnect is generating. Especially helpful if you've got a lot of different transformation or translation of that data, seeing the output on there. But in our case, we're leaving it going to Business Central directly, and we're working with the purchase invoice and with the purchase invoice lines as we're sending it in, because we're doing that transaction data. So when we switch to the integration tab, that's where this is defined. We can say what we're mapping to, the actual purchase invoice or the lines, one at a time. And then we also get to pick where that data is going. So I'm going to focus mainly on the target integration and the additional column on here, just to keep this kind of brief. But this is where we can match up all of the fields that we're passing in. So I'm going to expand this to show all the fields available on the purchase invoice. And as we can see, we're doing the vendor name, invoice date, payment date. As we go through, we're able to go ahead and pick our data from the source information. We can go ahead and pull that across and map it directly. Now, if something doesn't match directly, so for example, on the purchase invoice lines, that's where we can start generating our additional columns to go ahead and do that data transformation or to hard code anything that we may want in place. So if I expand this one out for the purchase invoice lines, we're going to have some of those hard-coded values going across for the type of lines. In this case, we're working with the GL codes and for the quantity. So we're passing the GL code to the number. This would normally have the item number, the GL account code number, etc., depending on what the line type is. So for the quantity and for the line type, we've actually hard-coded those on this integration because we know we're working with those GL accounts as we're doing, as we're pointed in from Concur. So to go ahead and build any of those additional columns, all we need to do is switch to this different tab on here, and then we're able to go ahead and build them out. So line type and quantity, those are fairly straightforward. It's a local constant, so you can just type in the value that you want it to always be when we're in here. If we need to go ahead and translate or modify data that's coming in, that's when we'd be using one of the other additional columns. So I'm just going to call this test for right now, because I'm not going to save it for good. But this allows us to go ahead and translate, if you've got different date formats between systems, if you need to generate a new transaction number and you want SmartConnect to generate it rather than using the destination system, we can use these rolling column options to do so. And if you have to actually translate the data itself, we can use either the calculation, which allows you to do scripting inside SmartConnect, or we can set up a translation where we're able to use an existing translation table and say, all right, here's the data you expect to get. For example, you might be getting a text value of, employee type or expense type of, sales, services, support, marketing, etc. You get that text value, but you want to translate it to a numeric value for your destination system of 1, 2, 3, 4, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, whatever the value is on the back end, we could use this translation table to do so. So we give you a lot of different options to go ahead and manipulate the data in the map or inside the integration, so you don't have to have that data perfect when you're picking it up before we go ahead and send that off to the destination. So finally, as we're building that integration, once you get to this tab and you have the fields mapped that you wanted inside of here, technically you can save and run the integration at that point. From that point on, we can add additional options and tasks and bells and whistles to the integration to make sure it functions the way we want. For example, I set up an alert here to say send email. So I got that email, I showed everyone on the call on this process, but this is where I was able to configure my email process. I could tell whether to include the failed records on there, and then I could use something that we call global variables to automatically populate this email with data from the integration as it's running. So I can see the full error list that we're getting. I can see how many records actually ran through, and I know what map ID and what run number it was, so I can go ahead and handle those failures later on. So with that, the final thing I would do with this map or with this integration, if I was actually going to set it up, is I would like to go ahead and schedule this process out to run. So again, we could go ahead and schedule this out. You can see I've got it disabled right now as I wanted to run it by hand as we were going through, but I can go ahead and edit this integration process. I can enable that, and I can set my schedule for running every day, running at specific days of the week. With Concur, if you do a period like we do, where it's once a month, you'd like to set this to run monthly. What we do internally is we run our processes on the second day of the month, which means that everybody has to have everything submitted, has to all be approved before that second day of the month, and then it gets picked up and ran through by SmartConnect for the Concur expenses for our ERP. So I went through a lot of different options on here. I'm coming to the end of my time for what we can present on, but I wanted to take a moment to talk about exactly what we're able to do with Concur in terms of how we pick up that data right now, what our plans are within the next few months, within the next year, et cetera, in terms of how we function with it. So as of today, I mentioned with Concur, we can extract that data in 3 main options. One is a manual file download. One is having Concur automate that extract file and send it off to an FTP server. The final option is going through their API. Now with SmartConnect.com and with on-premise, both of those are able to go ahead and pull a flat file or that extract data from either the file download or from an FTP server. For the API option, we do have a REST connector in SmartConnect.com that can authenticate to Concur, and we can pull data from different areas of Concur. Unfortunately, we cannot utilize their endpoint that gives us the extract file because it's giving us a file rather than that stream of data. We have to do some extra work in SmartConnect to make that possible. So if you want to use the Concur API as it is right now today, you have to use the on-premise option because we need to put a little extra scripting around the call to get that file from their API. What we're doing to enable that support and make this a cleaner process for us going forward is we're building out a dedicated Concur connection point specifically for the ERP side of it, because a web service giving us a file is a little frustrating and it's not the cleanest thing that we've ever worked with. So what we'll be doing is we'll be hiding that process behind the scenes. We'll build out a connector that we can connect to that endpoint. We'll make the call, download the file behind the scenes, save it, read the data off of it and display it to you, and it's going to function like any other data source connector we've got to this point. So the timing on that, we're hoping to have it done either at the end of this year or right away at the beginning of Q1 of 2020 here, within that first month, as this is something that we've ran across with multiple customers as a pain point, and we've worked with Concur, but they're not able or willing to change their method at this point. So we'll make the changes on our side to go ahead and streamline this process even further. But if you're connecting to it today, SmartConnect on-premise works with all three methods of extracting that data. SmartConnect.com does not work with that API connection yet, but that's what we're aiming to change on there. So with that, it's the final thing I wanted to leave everyone with is what our plans are going forward and how we work on here. I've got my contact information on this particular slide. For anyone that wants to go ahead and contact me around questions around this or around SmartConnect in general, I'd be happy to discuss anything. So what I'll do at this point in time is we'll go ahead and open this up for questions, either around the presentation, around Concur, around Business Central, SmartConnect. I'm good to answer anything. I'll leave it here for just a minute or two, see if anything pops in. And if not, we'll go ahead and wrap this up. And again, if you have questions, feel free to use either the chat feature or the questions panel. Everyone should have that available in their GoToWebinar environment. All right, we have got one question around. The question is, you said we get access to both SmartConnect.com and SmartConnect on-premise. What's the requirement for that? So I mentioned earlier on the call that if you, when you're purchasing SmartConnect here, there's the option to purchase it as a perpetual license. That applies only to SmartConnect on-premise, but you can also purchase SmartConnect as a monthly subscription. If you purchase SmartConnect with any of the monthly subscription levels, you don't have to decide what deployment type of SmartConnect you want at that purchase time, which means you're going to have access to either deploy, SmartConnect on-premise for your environment, or you can go ahead and spin up a SmartConnect.com login. Technically, you could have access to both at the same time. It's not something I recommend just from my perspective on the IT side. I would rather not manage my integrations in more than one place. But what we've done is we've made it easier so you don't have to choose which one you're using. The other benefit is if you wanted to start with SmartConnect on-premise and move to SmartConnect.com at a later date, as you move your systems more online, that is definitely an option as well. We're not going to make you repurchase anything from there. All right, other questions? Give it a couple more seconds here. I've not seen anything else come in. All right, so seeing nothing else, I want to thank everyone for their time today and their attention on here. Hope everyone got some valuable information out of this. Again, if you need to contact me, my information's been up on the screen for quite a while now. So I hope everyone has a good day, and we'll talk to you later. Goodbye.